The sun hung low in the late afternoon sky, casting long shadows across the dusty fields of Thomas Clay's farm. The air was heavy with the scent of dry earth and fading grass. Thomas, a man weathered by time and hardship, stood still, his rough hands folded in front of him. His skin was sunburned, cracked from years of tending to this stubborn land, but his eyes held a gentleness that belied his rugged appearance. Today, something different weighed on him, something deeper than the ordinary aches of old bones or the drought that had withered his crops. Before him, the last of his herd was being loaded onto a battered truck. The cold, weary, and spotted like a patchwork quilt was his final asset. Every other animal had been sold or lost over the past few hard years. The truck driver, impatient and silent, tugged the rope and secured the animal. Beside Thomas stood Rosa King, her shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. Her face was streaked with tears, her eyes red-rimmed and desperate. She cradled a small, fevered boy in her arms, Mika, no older than 6, whose skin was flushed with the heat of a high fever. His breathing was shallow, and his tiny body was limp except for the faint flutter of a weak pulse. The infection had taken hold fast, and without treatment. It was a death sentence. "They won't help him," Rosa whispered brokenly, her voice hoarse with exhaustion and fear. "The clinic," they said, "no payment, no care. We don't have the money. I don't have anything left." Thomas didn't speak at first. He watched the boy's fragile chest rise and fall, each breath a small miracle. The sun cast a golden glow on the worn lines of his face, the silent grief he carried like a second skin. The earth beneath his boots had swallowed many children before, he thought grimly. He had buried them all, neighbors' kin, even strangers' little ones who had slipped away quietly beneath his careful watch. He stepped forward and reached into his pocket, pulling out the rough rope tied to the truck. With a slow, deliberate movement, he handed it to the driver. "Take her," he said softly, nodding toward the cow. "Just make sure they save the boy." Rosa looked up at him, disbelief and gratitude mingling in her tear-streaked face. "You don't even know us," she said, voice cracking. Why help?" Thomas bent slightly, his gaze shifting to Micah's pale face. "I don't need to," he answered quietly. "I've buried enough angels in this soil." His voice was steady, resolute, carrying the weight of years spent watching life slip away like dust through his fingers. Rosa dropped to her knees, clutching Micah tighter as a fresh wave of tears spilled down her cheeks. The truck rumbled too. "Life," the driver giving a curt nod before pulling away. The last cow disappearing down the dirt road. Thomas stood alone now, the silence stretching out around him like a shroud. He felt an ache in his chest, not for the loss of the cow, but for the fragile thread of hope he had just handed over. A voiceover crackled in his mind, a bitter truth wrapped in a quiet promise. He gave his last cow for a stranger's dying son. He never expected to see them again, until the world turned upside down. The truck's dust trail faded slowly into the horizon, swallowed by the shimmering heat waves rising off the cracked earth. Thomas stood motionless, the weight of the day settling into his bones. The farm around him was quiet, too quiet except for the faint whisper of wind through the brittle stalks of dying corn. The fields that once thrived now looked like barren stretches of forgotten hope, mirroring the heavy emptiness inside him. He shifted his gaze toward the small farmhouse, its paint peeling and windows clouded with years of neglect. Inside, a kettle sat cold on the stove, the last embers of fire long extinguished. For a moment, Thomas allowed himself to remember better days when the laughter of children echoed across the fields, when the barn was full and the harvest brought more than just survival. But those days had slipped away, one hard season after another, leaving behind only memories and regrets. A crow cawed somewhere nearby, its harsh cry breaking the stillness. Thomas rubbed his weathered hands over his face, tracing the lines etched by decades of sun and sorrow. His eyes settled again on the empty pasture where the cow had grazed. Her slow, gentle presence, now just a ghost of the past. Behind him, the gravel crunch of footsteps caught his attention. Rosa's weary form appeared at the edge of the yard, Micah cradled carefully in her arms. The boy's skin was still flushed, but the fever seemed to have eased slightly. Rosa's eyes met Thomas's, a fragile thread of gratitude shining through. The exhaustion. She's a good woman, Thomas murmured to himself, watching Rosa step closer. And that boy, he's got a fight in him. Rosa lowered Micah gently onto a faded blanket spread across the porch steps, her hands trembling, as she wiped the sweat from his brow. "Thank you," she whispered again, voice raw with emotion. "I don't know how to repay you." Thomas shook his head slowly, the corners of his mouth twitching into a faint, tired smile. "Just take care of him. That's all I ask." For a moment, they stood in silence, two strangers bound by desperation and a flicker of hope. The sun dipped lower, casting a golden hue over the farm as shadows lengthened like fingers reaching for the past. Then Rosa spoke, voice barely audible. "What happens now?" Thomas looked out over the fields, the weight of uncertainty settling on his shoulders like the coming night. "Now," he said quietly, "we wait and we fight. Because in a world where kindness was scarce, where the soil swallowed dreams as easily as it swallowed bodies, sometimes all you could do was hold on to whatever hope you could find, Devon. If it meant giving away the last thing you had." Thomas Clay's life was carved out on a failing patch of land, nestled in the forgotten corners of a rural county no one outside the state seemed to remember. The farm was once a place of pride and purpose, where rows of corn and wheat stretched green and golden beneath wide skies. But the droughts that had gripped the land for years, combined with the collapse of the local economy, left the soil cracked and barren, and Thomas himself broken. His hands, once strong and sure, had grown rough and tired, as if carrying the weight of every hardship that had come his way. He was a man haunted by loss. His wife, Linda, had died a slow and painful death from an illness they couldn't afford to treat. Hospital bills piled up, debts swallowed his modest savings, and in the end, they had to watch her fade away in their small home, with nothing but memories and regret to hold on to. Their only child had died, even younger infant taken to soon, leaving behind a silence that no words could fill. Since then, Thomas had withdrawn into himself, carrying grief like a second skin, tough but fragile beneath. Despite it all, Thomas was known in town not for bitterness or blame, but for a stubborn pride and a kindness that ran deeper than most could see. People called him the man too proud to beg, too kind to charge, a phrase whispered with a mixture of respect and sympathy. Though the farm yielded less and less, Thomas found small ways to stay connected. He would trade eggs, vegetables, or help neighbors with odd jobs when he could. Nothing formal, no receipts or bills, just a quiet exchange of favors that kept the fragile community tethered together. The cow, the last of his herd, had been his lifeline for months, a rare source of milk, butter, and barter that brought some relief in a world that had little left to give. Selling her was the last choice he'd made in desperation, a decision that meant risking starvation in a place where every resource was precious. But when he saw Rosa and her boy strangers in trouble, Micah burning with fever, he couldn't stand by and watch a child die. It was a decision made with the heart, not the head. Rosa and Micah had been passing through on what should have been a simple road trip. A flat tire left them stranded on a lonely stretch of highway with no money, no insurance, and no one to turn to. The rural clinic had turned them away, unwilling to treat without payment, a cruel reality Thomas knew all too well. So he gave away his last cow without expecting anything in return, trusting that somewhere, somehow, the boy would find the care he needed. But the world didn't work that way. Days turned into weeks, And Thomas heard nothing, no word of thanks from the hospital, no sign of the family's fate from the town. The seasons shifted, but his isolation remained the same. The farm felt emptier than ever, the silence heavier. Without the cow, his food dwindled quickly. He started skipping meals, his frame growing thinner, his steps slower. Yet, even as hunger gnawed at him, Thomas refused charity. He was too proud to beg, too rooted in his own code, to accept help he hadn't earned. The neighbors noticed. Some offered small baskets of food left anonymously on his porch. Others tried to press him to come to town or accept government aid, but he would only shake his head. Thomas Clay lived by the principles carved into him by a lifetime of hardship, resilience, dignity, and a fierce sense of responsibility to himself and the land. He was a man who had given everything for others, and now he faced the harsh truth that kindness did not always come back. Yet beneath the quiet despair, something still flickered, a stubborn spark of hope, or perhaps the memory of his wife and child, pushing him to endure whatever came next. The land might be dying, the town might have forgotten him, but Thomas Clay was not finished yet, not by a long shot. 14 years had worn Thomas Clay down even further. His once steady hands trembled slightly as he swept the dusty barn floors and patched broken fences for meager wages, barely enough to buy a loaf of bread. His hair had turned salt and pepper, his back more bent, and his presence in town had faded almost to invisibility, just another face people barely noticed. The Clay farm, once a symbol of endurance, was now little more than a forgotten relic swallowed by time and neglect. Thomas no longer cared about dreams of revival or growth. All he sought was peace, a quiet place to simply exist without the weight of expectation or memory pressing down on him. But the small town was stirring with a different kind of energy. Word spread quickly that a big-shot investor was coming, someone with the means and vision to buy up the surrounding land and build a tech development center that might finally breathe life back into the dying county. The rumor brought a mixture of excitement and skepticism. Some hoped it was the beginning of a new chapter, while others feared the loss of everything they knew. Thomas, however, remained indifferent. Progress and profit meant little to a man who had already lost so much and was simply trying to hold. On a bright morning, the town's quiet was shattered by the arrival of a sleek, black SUV rolling smoothly down Main Street. The vehicle's polished surface reflected the sun, and a pair of stern-looking security guards stepped out, drawing curious eyes from every corner. The townsfolk gathered instinctively, whispers spreading like wildfire. Cameras and phones emerged, capturing the moment the investor emerged from the vehicle. He was young, late 20s, with a calm but confident energy that seemed to fill the space around him. His sharp suit marked him as a man of means and purpose, contrasting sharply with the weathered faces and worn clothes of the locals. The mayor stepped forward, clearing his throat and raising his hand to introduce the newcomer. "Everyone, this is Micah King," he announced, voice proud and hopeful. Thomas froze mid-sweep, the broom handle slipping slightly from his grasp. The name struck him like a bolt of lightning, slicing through years of dust and silence. Micah King, the boy whose life he had gambled his last cow to save, the child who had vanished from his world without a trace, leaving behind only the echo of a desperate act of kindness. In that moment the years elapsed, and Thomas's tired eyes locked onto the young man standing before him, no longer a fragile child, but a symbol of something unexpected, something that might yet change everything. Micah's return stirred a complicated storm in the quiet town. Though he carried the confident, polished air of a successful businessman, there was a strange distance in his eyes when they met Thomas's. No flicker of recognition, no hint of gratitude for the man who had once saved his life. Instead, Micah held press conferences in the town hall, speaking grandly about the future, about green technology, sustainable development, and millions of dollars he planned to invest. His words sparked hope among the townsfolk, many of whom were eager to sell their land and embrace the promise of prosperity. Yet Thomas remained skeptical. He listened silently as neighbors approached him, offering to help convince him to sell. But Thomas refused. His land was not just dirt and grass, it was the last tangible connection to a past filled with love, loss, and sacrifice. It was everything he had left. Micah's team soon shifted tactics. They brought cash offers, tempting sums meant to persuade Thomas to relent. But each time, Thomas shook his head firmly, refusing to part with the land. It wasn't pride alone. He sensed something beneath the glossy surface of Micah's plan, a risk that the soul of the town would be swallowed by corporate interests. What's more, Thomas's land occupied a crucial piece of the puzzle for the tech hub's layout. Without it, the entire development would stall, making Thomas a blockade in a wave of progress that was sweeping through the county. Tension grew like wildfire. Rumors swirled, voices turned cold, and the town that had once regarded Thomas with quiet sympathy now began to turn against him. "Don't ruin this for the rest of us," they whispered, their eyes hard with frustration. His neighbors, once his friends, now regarded him as a stubborn obstacle, an unwilling relic clinging to a dying past. The pain of their rejection cut as deeply as the legal notices that arrived soon after, announcing eviction proceedings on his property. The claims cited undeclared, tax defaulted, lander bureaucratic trap Thomas had unknowingly fallen into after missing some paperwork in the chaos of his struggles. The irony was bitter. A man who had given everything to others now found himself stripped of the only home left. One afternoon, Micah came to Thomas's small, weathered shack, his tone blunt and businesslike. "You're standing in the way of progress," he said, voice steady but devoid of warmth. "Why won't you just let go?" Thomas met his gaze, old sorrow and stubborn strength mingling in his tired eyes. "Because the only thing I've got left is this soil," he replied quietly. "I gave away everything else." His voice carried the weight of years of a life spent battling loss and hardship, of sacrifices made not for profit but for something deeper, something no money could buy. Micah, unmoved and unwilling to engage in sentiment, turned and left, without another word. The encounter left Thomas feeling more isolated than ever. That night, exhausted and overwhelmed, Thomas collapsed in his shack. When he was found and rushed to the hospital, the treatment he received was harsh and indifferent. Without insurance or means, he was relegated to the fringes of care. His dignity eroded along with his health. The cold bureaucracy that had haunted him years ago showed no mercy, but fate had a strange way of intervening. A nurse, while reviewing patient records, mentioned Thomas Clay's name to Micah's assistant, an unexpected connection reigniting a thread that neither man had realized was still alive. That single moment shifted everything, setting in motion a reckoning neither Thomas nor Micah could have foreseen. The past, buried beneath years of silence and misunderstanding, was about to break through in a way that would challenge them both and the future of the town itself. Micah sat stiffly in the sleek boardroom, the hum of the city's glass and steel pressing in around him, when his assistant burst through the door, urgency written across her face. "That farmer you're fighting in Cortomas Clayhe's, the one who gave up his cow for you when you were a child," she said breathlessly, holding out the hospital records. "The documents show your name, the town, and the cow trade as the only payment." The words hit Micah like a physical blow. For a long moment, he sat frozen, the realization crashing over him. This was the man who had saved his life, the man he had refused to recognize. Without a word, Micah stood abruptly, leaving the stunned board members behind, and drove alone to the hospital where Thomas was admitted. He found Thomas frail and hooked up to an IV, the same worn face from years ago now shadowed with illness and fatigue. Sitting beside him, Micah struggled to hold back tears as memories flooded back the smell of hay on a warm afternoon. The soft lowing of the cow, the steady kindness in Thomas's voice. "I remember now," he whispered, voice thick with emotion. Thomas smiled faintly, a tired but knowing glint in his eyes. "Took you long enough, boy," he murmured with a gentle humor that carried the weight of years. The floodgates broke. Micah's voice cracked as he confessed, "You gave up everything for me." Thomas shook his head slowly, a faint smile still playing on his lips. "Didn't expect repayment, just hoped you'd do something with the life you got." Micah squeezed his hand, tears streaming freely. "You gave me more than a life. You gave me purpose." In that quiet hospital room, surrounded by the sterile hum of machines, Micah made a vow to right the wrongs, to honor the sacrifice of the man who had believed in him when no one else would. Micah immediately halted all construction and development plans, stepping onto a stage in the town square to publicly acknowledge the man who had saved his life so many years ago, Thomas Clay. In front of the gathered crowd and flashing cameras, Micah told the story of the worn farmer who had given up his last cow to save a dying child, a story that resonated deeply with the community. He pledged to rewrite the entire project, not as a symbol of corporate progress, but as a tribute to the people who had shaped the town's resilience. Thomas was named a permanent advisor and shareholder of the new initiative, his wisdom and experience honored as essential to the project's success. The development was renamed the Claking Center for Rural Innovation, a testament to the unlikely bond forged between the two men and the shared future they now envisioned. Meanwhile, Thomas received full medical care, his dilapidated home was renovated, and respect flowed to him from every corner of the town. One day, Rosa returned with her no-grown son, Micah, and embraced Thomas with tearful gratitude. The reunion, a powerful symbol of healing and renewal. The mayor and many townsfolk approached Thomas, offering apologies, some with quiet shame, others openly weeping for the years of misunderstanding and neglect. At the dedication ceremony, Micah gave a heartfelt speech, declaring, "Progress means nothing if we forget the people who carried us through our darkest days." Thomas sat quietly among the crowd, holding a plaque etched with his name, receiving no fanfare but the quiet dignity of a man finally seen and honored for the sacrifices he made. A school bus rumbled down the quiet road and came to a gentle stop near the newly completed Claking Center for Rural Innovation. Children spilled out, their laughter filling the air with a fresh, hopeful energy that seemed to breathe life into the once-forgotten town. One curious child broke away from the group and ran eagerly to the side of the building, stopping short, in awe before a striking life-size bronze statue of a cow, its sturdy form gleaming softly in the afternoon sun. Beneath the statue, a simple plaque bore the words, "To the man who gave his last, so another could live." Nearby, Thomas sat quietly on a weathered wooden bench, his gentle smile reflecting a peace he hadn't known in years. The warmth of the moment seemed to wrap around him like a long-awaited embrace. As the child reached up to touch the bronze figure, a calm, steady voice whispered over the scene in a gentle voiceover, "You never know the seeds you plant when you give from the heart, but one day they grow tall enough to shelter the world."